Hello, and welcome to the Identity and Access Management Insights podcast by Integral Partners. We're a cybersecurity consulting firm that's focused exclusively on IAM, and that's what we'll talk about here. All right, so welcome to the podcast. Today I am talking with David Morimanno, or DJ as we call him. DJ is a senior manager on our advisory services team here at Integral Partners. So first, DJ, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. As you said, I'm with Integral Partners, but I've been both a consultant and in the corporate space for the past 15 years, primarily focused on cybersecurity early in my career and have transitioned to more of an identity discipline, probably, I'd say, circa 2009, 2010. Focusing on privileged access management all the way through identity governance and access enforcement and kind of every walk in life between. I've been an implementer as well as an architect and a designer of solutions within the identity space with about every vendor that you can think of that's out there, at least the mainstay vendors.
Quite a varied background, which logically explains how you ended up on our advisory team. So why don't you talk a little bit about what our advisory team does, the problems that they help address, and the activities that they can help perform at organizations?
So the advisory team is a little different than an implementation team or any other architectural team in the sense that we typically come in and help you get your feet really on a good foundation and help you understand what it is that you'd like to accomplish, how you'd like to accomplish it, and why you should accomplish it in a particular manner or a particular way. We've learned that over the years, especially as the identity space has grown and gotten more of a spotlight, that a lot of folks used to think they could just buy a tool and slap a tool in and solve all their identity woes. Companies are maturing in that philosophy in the sense that they understand it's more than a tool. It's around the process, it's around the organization, it's around the people, and the tool is definitely included typically in that scenario, but how that synergy works between all of those is very important. So the identity advisory team steps in and we help them understand all the pillars of that and devise a strategy on how they can be successful with revamping or simply starting greenfield with a new identity strategy. We typically come in and start with looking at what's working and what's not working, because you're not going to throw everything out. There are going to be things that probably are very valuable to retain. There are things that you're going to be doing well. And then the adverse, there's going to be things that need improvement and aren't as efficient as they should be. So we're going to help you highlight those and then devise a strategy to accomplish and address any issues that we find along the way.
And that's actually a perfect transition to the focus of this podcast, which is the PAM assessment activities that you and the advisory team can provide. So first off, can you provide an overview of what that service is and why it tends to be so popular? I know it's something that we've helped a lot of organizations with. So why do companies so often find themselves in a place where this service would be valuable? And maybe give us a few common use cases that you've seen.
At a high level, a lot of companies, they look at PAM, privileged access management, from a particular lens. And a lot of them do look at it as a project. They can slap in a tool to maybe address an audit finding or maybe introduce a policy to address some sort of line item for their ISO certification or whatever they're trying to seek and close. And they're very, not necessarily as a negative, but they're very single-threaded in their mindset around privileged access because it is very reactionary. It's not so much proactive. And what this assessment really does is tries to open up not just the core team's understanding of privileged access management, but the organization's understanding as to what privileged access management is, what it can accomplish, what it can do, how it can add value, when it can add value, and probably just as important, where it shouldn't play and where other scenarios and other solutions and tools probably would be a better fit than privileged access management. The other lens that they typically look at is, they, like I said, they think it's a project, they can slap in a tool, but it's single-threaded also in the sense of what they're trying to accomplish with it. Privileged access management is more than just having a password manager or a vault or a safe that you can put your credentials in, your secrets in, kind of put them behind lock and key or rotate them. Obviously, that's an aspect and a function, but that's just one function. And people don't look at it from the bigger sense of being more of a privileged identity management program. If I refer to it as privileged identity management, it really is controlling the entire life cycle of that privileged account's access. We're monitoring and tracking what they're using it for. We're ensuring that it's appropriate. We're elevating when it's needed to be elevated. We're alerting when it's misused inappropriately. Obviously, a lot of those are very mature privileged access management functions. And typically companies don't start with those and they mature into those functions. But if you're approaching PAM with a single mindset of, we'll scan the environment and find all of our local admins and put them into a safe and rotate the passwords, and now we have PAM, we got a mature PAM program, you're leaving a lot of really good functions and really beneficial features on the table. So we're really looking to step in and help you understand that and grow your mentality around what privileged access management really can do, what it's capable of doing for your organization, and kind of how far you can take it, regardless if you know what you're doing today or not. Like, we want to partner with you and help you understand what's possible.
Got it. So it's as much education as it is evaluation of their specific environment and their needs, and then making recommendations, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's education, not as a touch point, but education and re-education through the entire project. I mean, when we step in and we look at things, in a typical privileged access management assessment, we'll be looking at many different pillars and many different functions of privileged access management. And what we're really wanting to do is baseline where you are, like what's your current maturity and where does your maturity need to go? And when I say need to go, for example, we use a maturity score that typically goes from a 1 to a 5. A 1 being very ad hoc or even maybe non-existent, to a 5 where it's matured so much that it's not only in an operational state, but you're innovating and bringing new things to the table in that function. So we're looking at everything at a function level, giving you a good sense as to where you are currently in each of those functions. And obviously, if you're a 1, 2, or a 3, that isn't always necessarily a bad thing when you take into consideration your use cases, your business strategy, organization strategy, because not everything needs to be a 5 to be valuable. So we help you understand that as well. Where should you turn the key to move from a 1 to a 4 or from a 2 to a 3, and be okay with where that is, so that you don't get stagnant and stuck in this rotation of always trying to mature one particular function and never realizing the value of all the other functions if you were to give them more of an equal and divided attention instead of focusing on one feature. So once we've done that, once we've talked to you and got you aware of where your current maturity is, we take it a step deeper. And as we've been doing our analysis and as we've been talking and discovering the environment, we're going to be capturing along the way any operational gaps or any areas we think privileged access management could really help you, regardless if it's something that you're aware of it or not. And we take that and we put that in kind of a structured order of how you should address and how you should close those gaps. Now, these gaps, I want to be very clear, aren't necessarily always related to risk. Sometimes these gaps are operational. Sometimes these gaps are maybe just procedural. So what we've done is to ensure that your long-term strategy and your roadmap with privileged access management can be successful. And what we've learned over the years is you need to have a very solid foundation to build on. I mean, it's really good to say, I want to buy everything one vendor has and then put it in. But the reality is you have to have a good solid strategy and a good foundation. So when you buy these bolt-on pieces of the product, or you try to bolt on new procedures, you're bolting them onto something that is solid. You're bolting them onto something that can handle the load. So what we do is take those, and we have something that we refer to as a ROIE score. So that's the risk, and that's the operational impact, and then that's the effort. And we've learned over the years that too many times people put too much emphasis on the risk. They try to tackle the highest risk item first, And sometimes that's the most difficult one to tackle. Maybe that's the one that introduces the most operational impact and causes the at the end of the day, the project to turn stagnant and the tool to become shelfware because they're introducing too much impact in the environment. So what we've done is we take this score and we take into consideration risk, and we take into consideration the operational impact that potentially could happen in the environment by you trying to solve for this gap, as well as, and what I think is the most important, the effort that it's going to take. So we need to know how long does it really take to be successful with this. So, if I had to put a priority, in my mind, effort and operational impact outweigh the risk in this calculation. So risk is definitely important. I don't want to highlight that it's not, it is. But what we've done then is we take all these gaps, we take a formula that gives it a score, and we then prioritize and build an order of operations as to what we should be tackling and in what order, so that what we're tackling at that particular juncture is something that realistically can be obtained. Therefore, we'll be moving that risk needle. We're going to build confidence in the tool and the process and the program by tackling things that introduce minimal operational impact. And then over time, we're going to get to those more difficult items, or those items that are going to introduce larger impact to the environment or potential operational impact to the environment that if you were to do out of the gate would almost be a showstopper. And one thing I did not mention is a lot of times, to take into consideration how long it may take to implement a tool or a new strategy or a new approach, is we'll talk with areas like infrastructure, enterprise architecture, other groups, to get a good sense of how difficult it may be to work in your environment. For example, if you have a very dispersed set of data centers across the globe, and I need to put hooks into every one of those data centers to build a good repository of privileged accounts, that's going to be more complex than if I just had, one data center with a handful of servers all in one location. I've got one firewall to jump through and I can scan and get the list. When we tell you that we think you should be able to do XYZ in the time frame of ABC, it's based on some realm of reality for your environment. And almost every time we see a PAM program struggle, it's because they either did not take into consideration what the impact was going to be to their environment, or they didn't take into consideration how difficult it would be to put change into the environment and put the solution in place and ensure that day-to-day operations are not hindered.
Okay, DJ, that was a great overview. So why don't you run us through step by step what the actual activities are? I know that you guys have like a 90-point checklist you run through and report cards and all sorts of interesting activities. So can you just run us through step by step what it is that you guys actually do and how that helps with the process?
So what we like to do to take that a little bit deeper is we look at roughly about 90 different functions of privileged access management and what privileged access management could bring to the table, or from a privileged access management program, what you should be doing. And what we do is we evaluate each of those functions and each of those line items on a scale of basically a passing grade of an A all the way to a failing grade of an F. And we look at how your environment is handling those functions today. If it isn't, how are you addressing what the outcome of that function could be? And at the end of the day, when we run through all 90 points, we'll average out your grade and determine if your environment from a privileged access management perspective is kind of a failing or a passing grade. Now, the reason we do that is towards the end of this journey, when we've gone through and we've done this checklist and we saw your maturity score and where you're at, where you need to go. Well, that's fine, but how do I get there? Well, it's addressing all the operational gaps that we've listed. We've went through our scoring mechanism to determine what gaps you should be addressing first, as well as, oh, by the way, here's a 90 point report card that shows the exact functions and the exact issues that you really should be addressing to be able to close those gaps or to be able to move that needle on maturity and address risk at the end of the day. So what we've done is built you basically a blueprint to say, okay, let's take all of these functions and now let's turn this into a potential RFP or a potential checklist to give us some sort of guiding metric as we move forward with the program, so that we can check off, do we now do X or do we now do Y or do we now do A or do we now do B, and at what level are we doing that? And it comes with some level of definition to kind of help you gauge where you are in that spectrum. So not only do you kind of get that report card to say, hey, I'm passing, but I'm only a C, or I'm failing and I'm a D, you get a blueprint of something that you can actually act upon and something that you can reach out. And if you're going to do RFPs to find, vendors and tools to bring in, you know exactly what you need to ask them if they're capable of helping you with. And that blueprint really becomes the stepping stone of the next few steps of your journey with privileged access management. Well, at the end of the day, like I've mentioned, leadership is going to care about risk, and they're going to want to know how you're moving that risk needle. Well, that can directly relate back to this report card, and you can now say we are moving the risk needle because we are now rotating passwords on databases, or we're now introducing privileged elevation on workstations, or we're now introducing some sort of challenge and process to break glass in a break glass scenario. So all of those are encompassed in the report card, and you have a good sense of really the areas that you need to focus on. It's giving you a story. It's giving you where we are today, where we need to go from a maturity perspective. Well, how do we get there? Well, here's some operational gaps that you clearly need to use as either business cases or justification as to moving a program forward. Well, that's great. Well, what are all the gears that we need to turn? How do we close those gaps? How do we address and get the ball rolling? Well, here's the report card. Here's that blueprint. Here's where to start. Here's your areas of weaknesses. Here's your areas of strengths. Because like mentioned earlier on, it's not so much, always pointing out the things you're not doing and not doing well. It's putting that in conjunction with the things you are doing well, because there is a return on value with putting in a new solution, but there's also, some deprecation of your gains if you're not also including the things that you're doing well and encompassing and integrating those at the appropriate time in your overall strategy, as well as if you're not taking and giving credit to the teams that are doing the right thing. You could get some pushback to say, why are you changing my world when I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do? Like I'm checking all those boxes. Where if you were to encompass those scenarios and encompass those teams that are doing good, they may look at PAM as more of an enhancement instead of a change to their world.
So it's as much about what you're doing right as what you're doing or what you need help with or where the gaps are, essentially.
Absolutely, and that's what that report card really shows you. It really is the blueprint of all the functions that you should focus on, and the areas that you're doing well.
Yeah. And a lot of people, if you're talking about report card, they're just going to imagine, okay, here's a bullet and here's a passing or a failing grade or a grade. But really the next step, and you're wrapping it up into one final report that they're getting. But beyond the report card, you then move to how to fix those gaps, right? Talk about implementation, staffing, planning, those sorts of things. Can you talk about the activities around that and then how that works into the recommendation in the blueprint?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will reiterate that at the end of the day, the report card, although we're going to give you an averaged grade, you'll see your grade in each of those 90 functions. So it will be a breakdown as to where you are with those functions, and not just you got an A, a B, or C, and that's it. So the reason why we want to make sure there's transparency there is that we want to put together a roadmap. We want to put together a strategy when either it comes to an implementation effort to solve this, or maybe it's a staffing strategy. Maybe it comes to some sort of tool strategy, or maybe it's all the above. But the reason why we want that transparency with the report card is then what it is you need to tackle, and you can see clearly what we're recommending and how we're recommending, and the strategy and the approach and the roadmap on how long it's going to take should mirror that narrative of that blueprint. And should really cohesively tie back to those touch points where you can say, well, why are we doing endpoint management before we do password vaulting? Well, let's go back to the report card.
So beyond just a letter grade, you've got details around why the grade was actually given. And then from there, you talk about, the impact on the implementation, what staffing needs are going to have, and then why you're ordering things the way they are. And then get back to your earlier point, it also includes your OI and the E, right? The operational impact and the effort to implement. So that all plays a part, I'm assuming, in your recommendations?
Yeah, at the end of the day, those are all ingredients that we put in to kind of bake the cake at the end of the day.
Why don't you give me, then from there, why don't we talk about a real world example? So maybe a minute or two on a place that you've actually conducted this assessment?
Yeah, so we've done this assessment with many different verticals, with many different clients. There's been a large university or a large university healthcare system that we've done this with recently, where we've come in and really helped them understand the order of operations for an implementation plan, the staffing plan, the skills they needed to bring on board. For an example, they've already had made in their scenario the decision as to what tool they wanted to purchase and what functions of that tool, and they were going to go full bore into buying everything that vendor offered them, probably because they spoke with a really good sales guy. But at the end of the day, when we did our evaluation, we said, okay, let's pump the brakes a little bit. We think getting these tools is probably the right idea, but let's talk about what you're going to use them for. And we built an actual implementation strategy as to where they can take the most value out of what they're getting. And we were able to kind of keep them from purchasing some of the tools, right out of the gate, or at least implementing those tools right out of the gate, I should say, so that we can actually get that good foundation of the core product and putting in password rotation and discovery and learning what's in the environment and selling the idea of a full PAM program, all along the way of building confidence with the technical teams as to what's possible. So at the end of the day, they now have a multi-year strategy, a multi-year approach to eventually implement all of those tools and leverage those tools and what they're going to use those tools for. And what's more importantly, we kind of pumped the brakes on a few ideas as to what they thought PAM was. And so when we talk about other aspects of identity around lifecycle management, identity governance, administration, and auditing, and access enforcement, and there's a lot of different areas we can go down. Clearly, there are better solutions out there. There are better strategies and better approaches to tackle some of these than a PAM tool, because a PAM tool is designed to do what it's designed to do, and really not play in those other realms. It's designed to more integrate and enhance those other realms. So knowing that and getting them to come back to the table to understand that has led them to have a more cohesive strategy, where they're also going to be looking at identity governance administration and access enforcement, as well as looking at the request and service catalogs that they have, and how users interact with these solutions. But all that stemmed from a conversation of, like, let's come to the table and understand what PAM is and what PAM isn't. And let's talk about the big picture, not just a solid and mature PAM program, but a full identity program and what that really means. So what you may not need us to give you a maturity score. You may not need us to give you a report card. You may just need us to kind of just, understand that what your next steps are, and give you some recommendations. So we can be as light touch or as involved that we feel and that you feel is required to get you to the point of success.
Gotcha. It's a perfect segue to next steps. So they've engaged with our advisory team. Maybe it's for this PAM assessment, or maybe it's for an assessment. You do the same thing for IGA and all the areas within identity that we can go in and give them assessments, provide overviews and recommendations and roadmaps and strategies and all sorts of things. So what's generally the possible next steps? I assume one of them is of course, actually implementing the product or the platform and the strategy, which we do, right? We have teams on the PAM side and IGA side and access management side that then you transition over to them. Is that generally the next step?
It definitely is the majority of the time is the next step. But I will add that we come into this from the advisory side being vendor agnostic, being tool agnostic. We want to put a sound strategy together. Now, a lot of times that strategy does involve a tool, and it does involve typically one of the mainstay tools that are out there, because those tools typically are good at what they do, and we know those tools well. But there are times with those next steps where a tool may not be involved. Maybe it is just a staffing plan that needs to be put in place, or a procedure that needs changed, or maybe you have the appropriate tools already, and we're just going to help you understand the best way to use those tools. That's definitely a possibility, but I would say the vast majority of the time, it's either they need to have a strategy, and then tool as part of that strategy that they need to bring into the environment, or the strategy that they have around the tools that they have just isn't working. So we need to rethink the strategy, and sometimes that means rethinking the tool. So a lot of times those next steps are handing off our strategy to an internal set of stakeholders, and handing that strategy off to an implementation partner or an implementation team to make them reach that level of success that we put down on paper and put down on a plan to hopefully get them there.
Got it. Got it. And I know subject for another podcast, but a big part of what you guys help with is actually making recommendations for a specific vendor based on the needs of a company. So you guys have a whole process you guys run through, and I know that can be worked into this advisory as well, correct? Is that they know they need a solution. Very often they've narrowed it down, but if the vendor is the only source of truth, no offense to the vendors, it's difficult for them to figure out exactly what the right direction is. And that's something else you guys can help with, correct?
Yeah, that's something we can help with. It's that the vendor knows their tool and knows what their tool's capable of, but what they don't know are your use cases, how you want to accomplish those use cases, what your requirements are. A lot of times, the way the vendor is recommending it to be done, or the way that they're recommending to accomplish that objective, is probably going to be more in line with best practice than the way the organization is currently doing it. So there is a moment during the advisory where we have to talk about the processes and determine and say, yes, the vendor says they can do that, but let's put an RFP together and say how we should do it, and see if that aligns with the vendor. And where it doesn't align with the vendor, maybe we'll make recommendations that say to the client that they need to reshape their process so that it aligns with how the vendor does it. But sometimes it can be the adverse. Maybe it makes sense for some reason for that client to approach a scenario the way that they've approached it. And we need to know how can the vendor and the vendor's tool set adapt to that, because it's not always one-sided conversation. So we're there as the mediator to get to the realm of reality and the realm of truth as to how that solution and how that vendor will work in that client's environment, and not just a white paper that says they can do it.
All right. Well, thanks for touching on that. Certainly a subject for another podcast, because it's something that we provide a tremendous amount of value on. It's something that organizations out there struggle with a lot, and you guys have a great methodology and process for helping figure out what the right tools are. All right, DJ, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for everybody who is listening. And again, if you have any questions, if you're interested in maybe getting some of these activities done for yourself, or you just want to dig in a little bit more and talk to an expert like DJ or some of the other members of the team, we're happy to set up a call for you. So just reach out on the website and we'll be happy to set that up. So again, thanks, DJ. You have a great day, and we'll talk soon.